Thank you all for coming. It's really my pleasure to be here today. I couldn't be happier to be down here in Southern California and asking rhetorical questions because it really is. And we'll get into that. But to start off, I wanted to just spend a couple of minutes dialoguing about one thing, which is different formats of ways to describe urban design and street typology as it relates to active transportation. And that I mention that because it really fits within the core of my research, which has been kind of crossing these barriers between transportation demand management and behavioral nudge research, so behavioral economics, looking at complete streets design, and then the implications about how we can facilitate more travel via biking and walking, and perhaps the implications on many of our climate issues, but also in the last couple of years, really trying to move beyond the street or beyond the environments around the street and actually talking and dialoguing about the actual street. And I think that's one thing that we as planners have ignored in the past. And so I want to introduce two concepts that are well founded in the literature, and I try to emphasize on almost every thing that I write, the notion of suitability and accessibility. And I just want to point them out as two framing principles that I think we'll refer back to and just establish a little baseline. When I refer to suitability, I refer to the aspects that make a path of travel, pleasurable probably in the stream, but suitable for walking, okay, and suitable for biking. It really harkens back to some of the work by Michael Southworth in terms of the quality of the path and some of the attributes that make up the environs and support the decision to walk. We don't know a lot about how much they support that decision, but they do support decisions to engage in certain types of travel. Now, the counterpoint to that being accessibility, and I think we as a profession are very well versed in accessibility because many of us that do transportation are very familiar with this language of engineers. We're very familiar with the IT handbook, the concept of origin and destination, and the concept of people needing a destination, some type of land use diversity, and the notion of a street grid or connectivity to facilitate trips. So I make that distinction to say that we have two different realms and we understand them differently. And a lot of what we're talking about is trying to answer some of those questions, but it's also generating other questions. And in my view of research, I actually feel that my role is also not to always have the answer, but to propose sophisticated questions. So I'll start off today with some questions, and we'll probably end up with some questions. And you know what? I'm okay with that, and I hope you can. That's a question, perhaps a rhetorical one. So we'll break up the presentation into kind of three kind of groupings, starting off with the rationale, which will be a little short and succinct, and I think that we can probably have some consensus about that in the room. It's okay if we don't. Then we'll jump to the context and then some potential outcomes. This presentation is really a story of two cases in two cities. And so the outcomes will really relate to the context in those two cities. And I call it my double L's, and the big reveal will come later. The two cities, and then the outcomes based on some research and some case studies that I've been evaluating over time. And so we'll jump right into that, to some of the rationale, and some of this kind of frames my approach as well. Typical suburban block housing that facilitates perhaps trips that are automotive. So, and this is some of the rationale that drives my research in terms of, well, how can we facilitate streets that have active commuting? Is this the type of built form that we want? This used to be my commute in the Bay Area. Fortunately, I chose to take the rapid transit there, but this is a real situation, and perhaps something that we want to think differently about through a variety of strategies, and complete streets strategies can be one of them, but are they the only one? Another graphic of some of the built environment solutions we see on the bottom, I I guess the bottom left view of this photo you see my son expertly navigating this sidewalk ramp that's got this great awareness covering on it right to this, what Howard Frumkin refers to as sidewalkus interruptus, the disease that plagues many of our communities, where you see this treatment where pedestrians are prohibited from proceeding any further on this path. Of course, where there's a will, there's a way for this little guy. So, and this is also is kind of predicated on a lot of my work has been derived from the notion of these indicators and working with certain academics, Larry Frank, Reed Ewing, people that have kind of developed these bikeability, walkability indicators. And so the counterpoint to some of those indicators is the indicators in themselves, they don't indicate behavior, right? The indicators indicate maybe a propensity to behave a certain way. And so, I predicated a lot of my dissertation research, and this is a graphic from that, on some of this assumption that in a walkable environment that people will behave a certain way, but we know that that's always not the case, and there are other factors, perhaps referring back to our suitability factors that we introduced earlier. So this is some of the rationale, but let's jump to context. So we're going to start talking a little more about the urban design and the kind of the context of that design and the street typology. Now, this is a graphic from my hometown, our first L of Louisville, Kentucky. I'm actually not a native Californian. I grew up in the center of the country. Well, ex-girlfriend being important there, you should call it flyover state. But you can see here that this was a very reminiscent of probably what you would think of with many of the streetcar suburbs that surrounded both Los Angeles as well as San Francisco. There were trolley cars in Louisville. Louisville was featured very prominently in The Great Gatsby, for example, and had a bustling downtown that was, apparently was quite the place to be in the Roaring '20s. It also had something called, it had two-way streets. And that's one of the things that I want to present is from a context standpoint, that from a development of Louisville, they departed from. So the context of this was that Louisville became a commuter city. They converted those streets to multi-lane one-way streets in the 1940s and 50s, so that, and this is a kind of symptomatic of many of the boom towns that happened, post-war suburbs. If you've read Jackson's Crabgrass Frontier, very much the principle, same kind of dynamic that was happening in Levittown was happening here in Louisville, where they were facilitating travel from the suburban areas to the south, to the west. And in Louisville, you see at the top of the screen, the little squiggle would be the Ohio River. So this was a historic river town, and a lot of the historic core indicated by the darker area on this map is actually kind of what we consider the dense walkable core. So Louisville chose an interesting path from a typology standpoint of its streets. And I will say that now, having looked at this for over a number of years, they are not an anomaly. There are a number of streets, a number of cities that are exploring such strategies. But they're a case that I thought was very interesting because they chose to convert a couplet to one-way multi-lane streets to two ways. Now, interestingly, in this case, there was a parallel couplet that they chose not to convert. I don't have the full reason as to why not, but me sitting back as a native Louisvillian, notice the pronunciation, Louisvillian, was thinking, ooh, this could be a nice, interesting experiment. We have something happening here. If we can perhaps do some controlling here, perhaps control for exposure. This might be, something to look at. And so they converted these streets in 2011. Here's the context, the before context, 2 lanes going one direction in 2007, and then post-conversion, they simply restriped the streets, It is a little more complicated at the intersections, of course, and I've been involved with a couple of these professionally. Berkeley actually considered this in terms of flipping signposts on Bancroft and Durant, if you're familiar with the Berkeley campus, and it's not a cheap proposition. I'll say that right off the bat, but it's also not an expensive proposition, and we can talk a little more about the placemaking, perhaps the placemaking benefits of that, maybe in the question and answer session. My second L deals with another city that I've become a frequent visitor to because of certain areas of my research, and primarily based on the connection between design and finance, being London. And I'm showing here a graphic about the London congestion pricing area, and I want to actually bring up the finance piece first before we get to the talking about the physical design, so that the urban design characteristics. Why I find this so fascinating is because the way that the London is being able to operationalize a combination of carrots and sticks to not only facilitate what some people were skeptical about, was there going to be economic growth? And this is from a colleague of mine who did her research on this area. Her name's Andrea Brodus, provided me with this graphic to use. But not only did it facilitate economic growth in the core, and it didn't hinder it, but it also created some outcomes. And we'll start off with the outcomes here on the street, in that many of the outcomes ended up being streetscape urban design efforts that are very reminiscent of what we would think would happen elsewhere in Europe, and perhaps not very English of them, perhaps a little more Dutch of them, but are very fascinating applications, and applications that you really harness this advantage of 150 million pounds a year. So back to some questions, and just a reminder while we're getting into some outcomes. So from a design standpoint, thinking about the typology, the street design, can it increase safety? Can it change the environment for non-automotive travelers? We have some data. This was published in JAPER late last year. I believe it comes out in print, I believe this winter. But there is some suggestion that it may. Similarly, can these type of pedestrian scale urban design efforts have this dividend effect? Can they actually bring about this triple bottom line sustainability or resilience? There's some other work that suggests that too. I think there's more work to be done on that area as well, especially in the economics and finance area. So let's take them in reverse order now. Let's focus on London outcomes first. Huge success is really all you can say about the congestion pricing policy, but probably more a success for transit. And if you look at people entering central London, by and large, pretty constant. And this is actually interesting because the growth, and this is from Ms. Brodus's research, the growth actually does not go down over over what was pretty much an international recession. So that's pretty interesting. But what I find fascinating about some of the data that you can pull on this is that just a staunch dip between auto ridership and auto use, and really transit, but also biking and walking, which I've also seen they're taken out of scale by the massive story of transit. So at the bottom line, and the congestion pricing charge has yielded about 150 million pounds a year in transit, bicycle, and pedestrian infrastructure. And by and large, now they are going more towards bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. And I've been able to do case studies on about 12 locations in London where they've really invested in the physical design of streetscape. And I want to show some pictures of some of those. And I'll talk through kind of the design attributes of each one of them. I also would encourage you, I have some video on one of my websites. If you'd like to check it out, you feel free. It's available to anyone. There's no passcode or anything required. It's also interesting that they're not only in the congestion pricing area. They're spread all throughout London. So they really are dispersed in a way that I think spreads the benefit more broadly. And we could dive into that more, because I think here I had the pleasure of working on some of the RTP plans this past summer, and I know there is quite a dialogue in the Los Angeles region about gentrification and displacement, and I think that's a really important dialogue that is still happening in London, for example, in places like Barking, just like it's happening here. So Exhibition Road. This is a graphic from what I think is one of the best examples that kind of pulls on some of the principles of naked street design, kind of quasi Hans Monderman-esque. You can see lots of different surfacing techniques. This is one of my favorite pictures I've been able to take while over there. And the reason is I was able to video this female cyclist on the top right of your screen, basically riding the entire segment of this street, weaving in and out of traffic, going contraflow, but also really experiencing what this street was designed for, to be an interactive street where the cars and the pedestrians and the cyclists experienced a mixed flow environment. Obviously facilitated by the perpendicular striping and the perpendicular paneling on the ground. But really also facilitated by an investment in bike share and other attributes that really make this an interesting case study. I will actually kind of one sidebar with all of these examples, especially these European examples, is the use of pavers. And to me, this is a really interesting design dialogue that's a bit tangential. But when you think about embedded carbon in the way we surface our roads, our traditional concrete and asphalt US treatment is perhaps provocatively a little less sustainable than a surface, for example, this surface, which can be replaced, but also doesn't necessarily always have embedded carbon in the product, or is not a fossil fuel-based carbon in the product. One of the reasons I also like to emphasize on this picture on the right side of your screen is that you see one of the principal oppositions that we see to many kind of naked streets treatments are from our public works staff, and who will raise issues about drainage and water retention, but also from our fire and life safety professionals who are concerned about bollarding and the ability to access in cases of emergencies. And I would offer that some of the lessons of this London outcome are really in this lesson of experimentation and focusing on existing assets. The bicycle superhighway, sometimes seen as controversial because it does promote bicycle and pedestrian conflicts in London. That's actually been a big dialogue, but it has also been a huge success in promoting mode shift to cycling in London. But it's also a thing of experimentation. We aren't going to get into the design of this particular intersection, but those of you who are experienced in traffic engineering and transportation planning, this intersection does not exactly function the way many of our Portland left turns actually in the US should, based on handbooks. It has some flaws. But in London, given the constrained space, they've been doing experimentation without the bounds of some of our engineering constraints that are very fascinating and perhaps lessons for US application. Similarly, looking at constrained environments and looking at how can we make this pedestrian walkway work, perhaps maybe the tool is to actually completely pedestrianize it. Rather than actually to try to fit in what we see as mixed flow. And I think there's other people, including one of my colleagues, Cornelius Nwersu, who've been trying to change the dialogue about the notion of mixed flow. Maybe separation is something that we should embrace more wholeheartedly in terms of thinking about some of these spaces. Provocative? Do we have the answer? Probably not. It probably is provocative. Sorry, I should point out that this is the London Bike Share. It is no longer Barclays, and I had two friends that were joining me and accompanying me on the way home for my two lovely little boys. So we also have examples of bollarding, and on the right-hand side of your screen, treatments that you would never see in the U.S. to actually deal with disability-related, accessibility-related issues. So here we have the infill. Of course, it is with asphalt. When I was dogging on asphalt a little while back, but what you see is really an experimental ad hoc treatment to an issue that provides a workable solution in this case. Okay, let's transition from design in London to the notion of typology in Louisville. This interesting case study really did have some suggestive results. On these two streets that were converted, so again, think about it, there were 4 streets, 2 of them were not converted and 2 of them were converted. They're all geographically in the same place. They all had relatively the same traffic flow. And they all relatively had the same kind of built environment conditions pre-conversion. So we had a dramatic reduction in collisions, and we were able to control, for some of that, not all of it. But so, is there some leakage in this data? Probably, but it's a case. It suggests that maybe more research might be available. The interesting and provocative thing that I should point out here, especially on this slide, is that despite the fact that collisions decreased on these two-way streets, there were actually more, the volume actually increased. So we were actually able to document a higher volume and a reduction in collisions. So these are all types of collisions in aggregate. Thank you for that clarification. And we have it separated out in other formats, but I've simplified that. So yes, that's correct. This is all collisions. We were also able to see a reduction in speeds, and we went out and since then have taken some speed checks with radar guns. At the same time, during a recession that really hit Louisville, kind of a quasi-Rust Belt river town, really hard. A couple years ago, while the rest of the economy was going up, Louisville still had double-digit 12% unemployment, and really suppressed property values. That these two street segments definitely experienced an uptick in their property values over in the 2 years afterwards, which suggests that there may be something to this public sector investment as well. And it was as much as 39% on one of the streets. It wasn't as exaggerated on the other street. But if you consider that the rest of the city, as well as the other 2 streets, definitely had a downward trend, it's fairly provocative. We actually, since then, over the same time period, I've done some aggregate information, aggregate studies on Louisville as a whole. And if you took all the one-way streets and two-way streets citywide, there is a differential. So if you took a cross-sectional look at property valuation on different types of street, that does suggest there may be something about the traffic conditions in those that are, or it could be something else that may have a benefit from a property valuation as well as a municipal taxation valuation. And this is where I think if we can make that case that there is a municipal benefit, I think that's a really powerful thing to talk about. Just in one section of town, in a fairly depressed section of town, it could yield a significant amount of lost taxes. We were also able, amongst the many correlates that I was able to look at, one of the things we saw was a reduction in crime in this area, which I wasn't totally anticipating. And based on some interviews afterwards, there are a lot of people that believe in the principles of crime prevention through environmental design. CPTED is a very, in my background as a military planner prior to working for UC Berkeley, we try to do crime prevention through environmental design. And after I went to PhD school, I learned that was very physically deterministic. I could never do that. But there may be something about this, the design of the street. Perhaps, the Urban Land Institute would suggest that people window shop, or would suggest there's a placemaking value that has perhaps business generating, that people want to get out of their cars or stroll or cruise the neighborhood. some quick photos to kind of try to illustrate the differentials are also pretty interesting. Now these are selected, so they are probably the best and the worst examples, so I'll give you that. But you do have really thriving businesses in one area, and some examples over the last couple of years. Now this building actually has had a little more neglect in the last couple of years, but you do have some lack of investment on many of the one-way segments, but also some more recent neglect of some of the properties and some depression of some of those properties. And this is actually parallel to the closest street to one of the converted streets. And so if I'll cycle back and show one of the pictures where there has been a lot of property investment, and we've looked into that too. Parallel to that are some streets that actually have had a significant amount of disinvestment. So I think it does bring up some questions about, are there other things happening in these areas, and what are the potential dividend investments on these public sector investments in the streets? And I think that's an area where I don't claim to have the answer, but maybe this is one answer. Question mark. So the key lessons of for this is I do think we asked an obvious question to start off with. They matter. Do we fully understand the full scope of that? No. Do we presume to? No. But is it worth looking into more? Is it worth dialoguing about it? Absolutely yes. And they may. I have a hypothesis, especially with this idea that in our interviews we got people talking about the notion of window shopping, people driving slower on these two-way segments. Some of the research I think that needs to be done is if people are familiar with the exponential curve between street width and speed that I think Peter Swift developed about 30 years ago. Definitely the wider the street, typically. Yes, his name is Swift. His name is Swift. The irony lives. It really does suggest that there may be something happening with relationship to that. I have a hypothesis, and I'd like to test this over the next year or so, that people perceive multiple lanes of one-way traffic as being part of their own lane, that they perceive a multi-lane one-way street as being their entire right-of-way. I don't know that. It's definitely an area of future investigation of mine. And we're going to be doing some video-based investigation over the next 6 months to try to kind of dive into that a little more. It also can relate to aspects of visual interest, I think, is what my interviewees suggested. But I think that argument, that hypothesis is a little weaker. It's not as well founded on other literature. So the verdict's out, but there appears to be something happening here. And I would say, I said this is not an anomaly. This is happening everywhere. I was called by a newspaper in Iowa this morning on my drive down here because they, in fact, are thinking about we want to convert our downtown streets back to two-way. Can you tell us what the benefits are? I was like, I don't know your streets at all, but there in certain case studies there can be an advantage to do this, and so. I have this picture up there. This is my hometown, a little bird right on the exurbs of Louisville, where I grew up. I was born here. It's called New Albany. They also are considering converting their streets, and it's become this grassroots movement where the people are actually asking for this. The politicians aren't the one asking. You can see the lawn signs throughout the town that say two-way streets now. We must have this. Which is really interesting, and they're starting to see, is this not only a traffic calming tool, can this be an economic development tool? And I think that's a really not only a provocative area, but perhaps an area where we as an academic organizations probably ought to start exploring a little more. And I think that the ramifications as we see more and more technology that allows us to shrink that right of way. There may be even more argument that street investments in what was that public right-of-way can become part of this private, beneficial kind of regeneration tool. So with that, I will turn it over to Q&A. I drive a big bike. My name's Billy, and these are my two little ones. I'm happy to answer any questions about not only this presentation, but also my professional experience. And I'm also, I've shared this already with you on SlideShark. If you want to go, it's shared on my Twitter account if you'd like to have it, and I'm happy to answer any questions offline as well if people are more comfortable in that format. So, thank you very much.
Well, Billy has been focusing in, I think, on a couple of key aspects. He's been looking at the one-way, two-way street discussion. He's been also looking at some research that has some initial kinds of conclusions, and I think the latter part is going to be very important in the environment. We are here, particularly in Southern California right now, and addressing these issues. Let me talk about our focus on streets, broader than just one-way, two-way streets, but the nature and the importance of street being part of the realm and good placemaking. Actually, interestingly enough, has come sort of hand in hand with the rethinking about our overall patterns of urbanization. Over the last couple of decades, we in the planning community, the design community, have been talking a lot about infill versus sprawl. We've been thinking about, indeed, not orienting all of our development around the automobile, but also beginning to re-examine the role of walking, the pedestrian, the bicycle, the transit, and indeed all sort of forms of movement of how we get from place A to place B and place C, et cetera, throughout our community as well. And this has been driven by a number of really important factors that I think we need to consider. One of which is legislation, because we are increasingly as planners being told that there are certain benchmarks and thresholds that we need to be aiming towards, such as the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, the climate change initiatives and legislation in California, executive orders from the various governors, at least two governors over the last couple of decades, have profoundly affected what we as planners do as we're developing our plans for our communities and our community planning efforts as well. What's also interesting about this, the timing of this, it's also been indeed linked to a change in the demand marketplace. We are learning that millennials would love, if given the choice, and research that's been published through Urban Land Institute and other publications, et cetera, that there is a strong contingent, a strong cohort of individuals out there who prefer to live in places that can walk to where they work or walk to where they shop or get on a bicycle. So while for many years we kind of, as planners and regulators, has created land use zones that focused on the individual piece of property, we're also now beginning to realize that there is this other network to tie those individual decisions on individual parcels together, and the importance of the street as providing that connectivity in that community and making that great place has become very important. And the choices of millennials is not just driven by legislation, but is a different population, in fact, that is basically saying maybe our old rules, maybe this is somehow in our election that we're seeing in our crazy election process right now, is also being seen there in terms of the change that we're seeing out there in the world as well. What the implications are pretty important, and I think Billy has explored some in terms of the effects upon crime and economics, et cetera, within this area. Let me give you another kind of case example. We just completed the work in the city of Pasadena, on the city of Pasadena general plan, and we learned very early in the process where the debate has been by members of the community that infill is wrong. We want to go back to an old Pasadena model of, in effect, suburbanization, et cetera. We were able to pull together data in a community that has had some degree of sophistication of multiple modes of transportation now for about the past decade. We were able to pull together data that suggests that if you live in the core of Pasadena, in the downtown area, that the actual per capita trip generation is 36% less than if you live up in a more suburban single-family neighborhood of Pasadena. If you live up by the Rose Bowl, your trips are significantly greater. And it's partly because of the walkability of downtown, the nature of how the streets have been designed to get people to move around very efficiently, and indeed also the increments of additional density and the mixture of uses that have occurred downtown. In downtown Pasadena, you can walk to 3 or 4 grocery stores. You can walk to the movie theater. You can walk to one of the few great remaining bookstores in the United States. You can indeed walk among various multitude of places, et cetera, and it's all tied to, indeed, the mix of uses and that integration of making great streets and make streets that provide connectivity as well. So while we're espousing these benefits, et cetera, let me also say at the same time, we need to be cautious because we are now experiencing, particularly here in California, particularly in the Los Angeles region, backlash to these ideas. The city of Los Angeles adopted about 2 years ago a new mobility plan for the city of LA that looked at the nature of streets, looked at various layers of pedestrian networks and transit networks, et cetera, and the aging baby boomers sued, and people who are white and elderly sued, and basically had pulled the mobility plan to a grand halt. So this notion of creating this mixture of modes and transportation and looking at design and character of streets is basically subject to a significant lawsuit. This, by the way, are the same people who have the neighborhood integrity initiative out there on the streets as well to basically stop all development, which will stop all development in the city of LA. So we're facing these incredible challenges in a very different community than city of LA, in the city of Temple City that has a very successful series of, like the London Bikeway improvement on Rosemead Boulevard, a major arterial. That city received an $8 million grant from Metro to add and expand that bikeway through the core of the community on Las Tunas Avenue. 2 weeks ago, the city council basically voted to give that money back to Metro because of the public opposition to making the street a great place that had great design qualities. It was going to be conducive to walking and conducive to biking, et cetera. So we're in this incredible era of where we planners have basically bought into the notion, and communities and millennials have bought into this notion of making indeed communities that are more efficient from transportation standpoint, great streets, et cetera. And we're now facing incredible legal challenges out there as well. And that's where the data that Billy has shared, and the same kind of data we learn in Pasadena, is very important. The more that we can do research, we're going to need to be able to, if we're going to successfully see this move into the next generations of development, we're going to need to be able to rely upon this data to say, you know, when you challenge bikeways because of crime, you're wrong. Or when you challenge the use of the street and the data, you're wrong. Or if you basically tell us that the bikeway in front of your building is going to cause economic chaos and no one is ever going to shop at your building, that the need to have data to say, hey, maybe that's the concern you have, but let us present to you information that challenges, that says something different. Our turning point in the Pasadena general plan, because we had basically a lot of NIMBYs, naysayers, et cetera, saying no more, we've done our job here as well. The turning point was a gentleman who was about 28 years of age, who stood up at the conclusion of a meeting with 300 people where 299 basically said, it's time to stop. The gentleman stood up, looked around the audience and said, you know what, let me tell you a story. My wife and I moved to Pasadena 4 years ago. We came to Pasadena because we chose Pasadena because we wanted to live in an environment. We came from Chicago, we had a car in Chicago. We chose Pasadena because of the culture, because of the history, and because of the opportunity, and looking at the great streets and everything about Pasadena, and the ability of my wife, who has a job in downtown LA, to get on the Gold Line and to take transit downtown and not have to have the automobile. He then went on to tell the story about how he had his car in Chicago. They sold the car because they found in Pasadena they didn't need the car because of the nature of how they had developed the sophistication of multiple transportation system. And then he turned to some of the older generation in the room and said, who are you to tell me and my wife that we shouldn't have the choice, the opportunity for this other kind of lifestyle, a place I can walk, a place I can bike, a place that I can get around very efficiently as well. He pointed to the chair of the Planning Commission and said, you live in your green and green design house. We're not taking that choice away from you. You still have that choice. What we're saying is our generation wants a new choice. So I think we're facing these incredible challenges about some of the things here that Billy has been talking about, because streets are incredibly, incredibly important, and how we relate the design of those streets to actually the design of the uses that go on the parcels adjacent are very critical. I've been part of my profession going back to West Hollywood days when we were looking at West Hollywood 30 years ago, when we were talking about these issues back 30 years ago in West Hollywood. So what I do is challenge us to begin to build upon the kind of work that Billy is doing here, because I think this is going to be absolutely critical if the public is going to buy in, if the elected decision makers are going to actually believe in this as well.
Billy, one of the things that strikes me about the Louisville example that you gave us is that design is also an outcome as well as a lever. And so I'm just kind of wondering whether you can talk a little bit about the decision making that went into allowing this street to change, but not this street. Yeah. Because there's part of me that kind of wonders if maybe there are some exogenous changes.
Well, I think fair point and fair critique, and I'll say that. Well, no, I think that there was a degree of, from a policy standpoint, it's hard being a planner in California and trying to put yourself in the Midwest. And I think, unless there are any Midwesterners out there, it's definitely, oh, okay, so for all us Midwestern, I think sometimes I have to put my Midwestern hat back on. And think, okay, this is doing a complete streets plan for the city, which is what they did in 2010, was a huge endeavor, and they worked with Fair and Pierce to do that. So there was some seeding of some of these ideas to start off with, and but really a seeding of, we need to really reframe the way that our populace travels too. And one of the main reasons that Louisville was exploring this was actually a lot of emphasis from the Obama administration, particularly Michelle Obama. Louisville was one of the principal Let's Move towns for her healthy living, active commuting campaign. So particularly in Louisville, there that predated this conversion, a move afoot to facilitate more active commuting. I think that so behavioral interventions have their own set of limitations. And so I think that that kind of is in a realm of on its own. With regard to the physical design, this was really the outcome of one of these processes, and it was run as an experiment. What will happen in this location? It wasn't a bottom-up decision. It was really a top-down decision. Will this improve functionality? And our consultant here is telling us that it may reduce, result in safety implications. But I think that the verdict is still out. There's pretty mixed. There's not a lot of literature in this area right now, not from an traffic operations standpoint as well as a traffic safety standpoint. And a couple of my colleagues in the biking and walking kind of academic community have expressed their opinion as to why they think perhaps two-way streets may be safer, especially from a pedestrian crossing standpoint. But I think too that some of that is speculation at this point as well. So there wasn't it was really a top-down decision. I think it was put the answer most simply.
Considering the controversy over the plans in Los Angeles and Pasadena, to what extent did the city departments engage community groups prior to the release of the plan? And do you think that was sufficient? And could more be done in terms of that aspect of drawing them in early rather than hitting the controversy?
In Pasadena, the engagement to the public was probably, in my career, other than West Hollywood back 30 years ago, where we spent over half the budget in community engagement, It was probably the highest level of engagement I've witnessed in preparing a general plan for a community. There were probably well in excess documented in the general plan of close to 10,000 participants throughout the 4-year planning process as well, including incredibly diverse media. I mean, we're getting into social media now and other kinds of media that we didn't have 10 or 15 or 20 years ago as well in terms of effective communication tools. What really became powerful is that gentleman that I mentioned in the meeting, in the public workshop. He went out because of that. He looked around and saw 299 other voices, contrary voices. What he did is he went out and organized a new constituency of downtown Pasadena residents. Did it exist before the general planning process? He organized the constituency, bright, educated, younger people who also made their faces visible in city council meetings, which had never happened up to that point in time. So it was a generational change, and it involved a lot of community organization to the point that the very first key benchmark before the entire plan was completed, but the very benchmark where we went to the council to get buy-off that were headed in the right direction, these people walked in and orchestrated a presentation that the mayor at the time, Bill Bogart, had been there for like 15, 20 years, basically said, I've never seen a presentation so well and so efficiently. That changed the direction of the city council. LA, on the other hand, interestingly enough, the person who was the planning director or community development director in Pasadena is now the planning director in the city of LA. Vince Bertoni moved, just changed about 3 weeks ago. Vince has got a job on his hands, and I was involved in the general plan framework for the city of LA back 20 years ago, which is still the overarching planning document for LA. And comment that I have is the one positive thing of the neighborhood initiative, maybe it will force the city council to really believe that planning has to be done in the city of LA, and they'll put money into it. The issue in LA, and why all the backlash occurred, is planning department is severely understaffed. They are severely overstressed. You have one planner working in the city of LA planning department who's responsible for the San Pedro community plan, the Boyle Heights community plan, and now had Hollywood dumped on her shoulders as well. That population base is greater than the cities of Pasadena, Glendale, and Burbank combined, and if you add up all the planning staff for those 3 cities in comparison to one planner. The real problem we have in the city of Los Angeles, at least as a jurisdiction, I don't know how you can manage it without a massive infusion of funds. So the real problem in LA has been, indeed, we don't have enough staff, and the city council doesn't budget.
2 things, and one of which I'm sure about, and one of which I'm not so sure about. So start with the one I'm not so sure about, which is is Woodie's suggestion about outreach. I don't actually. It's funny, engaging millennials is still, I have questions about, and I think I remember a quote from one of your lovely faculty about when will the millennials get out of their basements and out of their parents' basements. And I think you may remember that quote. No, it's the academics have been discussing for a long time about how will millennials or how will younger people engage, and is technology the tool, or are these new tools that do, the answer? And I think they can be effective. Are they? I think we may want to question that assumption, but maybe we want to question it from a different strategy in terms of our approach to planning as well. It may be the approach, rather than trying to mobilize people who may or may not be mobilized. I hope they will be. I hope that I can somehow inspire millennials and people in my generation and generations younger than I to be politically engaged. I just don't know if they care. But maybe there's a new practice-based framework that can be explored, where we revisit advocacy planning. We revisit Norman Krumholtz and David Off, and these people who were really, they weren't in the desk, they were out in the community. They weren't they were advocating for these people in the face of power. They were planning in the face of power. And I think that we might want to examine our practice in the face of that, not to question your practice, because I'm sure you're doing that. But as a profession, I think that may be something that could nudge us, because I don't think technology is simply the answer. And I think we do have issues with, one of the things we haven't discussed a lot is the right to the city dialogue, and whether or not our efforts to facilitate complete streets and many of these urban investments, if they in effect push people out into less desirable areas, and I think that's an area of utmost concern of mine, and I think that will be of continued concern as we try to do these smart growth measures, or measures that actually mitigate climate concerns. So let me say though that I do have one thing, one strategy I do think that's important is embracing this notion of, and I think would be successful, is embracing the notion of tactical urbanism. So embracing the notion of micro tests, of putting hay bales out in the street, of doing things that are not permanent, to test the public palate, to see if people can handle the traffic. And I'll cite two examples. The first of when I used to live in San Francisco when I was still practicing, and I remember the first parklets that were introduced that predated the parklet program, and they were wood pallets. They were wood pallets with coated, the plastic green, grass, whatever it is, the fake grass. And that was interesting. The other example was that we had some success in Berkeley and Richmond about 4 years ago in getting a fire department comfortable with a roundabout by simply throwing a pile of hay bales in the center of an intersection and bringing them out to the intersection and making sure that they were comfortable that they could make the turn in their vehicle. And it's that kind of experimentation, and I think it harkens back to my presentation, that I think we're not doing, and I think we ought to be doing a little more of. We ought to not think of permanence, but to think of these tactical solutions that lead to our end planning goal.
Let me quickly echo that. It's easy for planners, and I think LA planners were very derelict in going to Hollywood by the fact that all they did were had tables and charts and nothing. You sell, and the community will begin to accept doing things a little bit differently through seeing in the real world those experiments that have been successfully implemented as well. Working Corona a number of years ago, the community said all one-story buildings. We got people in a van and took them, not to LA, but we took them to Brea, which has they basically transformed suburbia into a little bit of a walkable downtown with 2 or 3-story mixed-use buildings. But it wasn't part of their vocabulary up to that point in time. It's not in their life experiences. They didn't know that, but they went and they saw it. They had the experience of that, and they said, this is kind of cool. Maybe we want this in our community. It's the same thing on the parklets, et cetera. If you have that experience rather than a traffic engineer coming in or an urban designer and saying, take away the immediate reaction, take away that parking space over the hallowed parking space, but then to have the experience of that, you begin to get sales of that, if you will, and ownership of that because of that experience.
So I'm curious about how this money that comes from road pricing is actually used, and how much of it goes to new street designs, how much of it goes to subsidizing public transit. I don't know. And
right.
Also another question, what governance setting is required to make such transfers between also?
So that was, you asked about governance required to make that happen?
Yes, and how does it actually work, like those interactions between?
Well, the answer to your question could be an entire lecture in itself. But put simply, there's enabling legislation that not only deals with how the policy is laid out on the city, and I'll come back to that, but also how the funding is broken down. And something actually we don't do in the state of California that we probably ought to think about in our general planning process in the future is that in the enabling legislation there is actually some targeted breakdowns in terms of how the funding should be allocated. One thing you asked was subsidization, so some type of incentive-based policy. I'm actually not aware, because I'm focused in the infrastructure, I don't know that I'm the one to answer that. I'm not aware if there is a certain amount of subsidization of, and the percentage subsidization of the ticket. It is transit, so I'm sure there is some subsidization, but it is also a bad comparison to the subsidization that we do in the US, because TfL is one of the more profitable transit or operators in the world. So I think I'm not able to answer that question to its full. But one of the things I am that is interesting is that specifically there are infrastructure targets, and there is the enabling legislation does indicate that it should go for on the ground things that people can see. And one of the things that you'll notice if you travel to London over the next couple of years, or you've been there recently, is that the buses aren't the cute buses that you remember. And that was one of the first investments they made within the first 5 years of the grant, was they completely revised the bus street. So while they've started to that infrastructure piece has started to invest in more bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. It's really a story of encouraging and facilitating transit, and especially above ground transit, not the underground. Although there is some funding from the underground for the underground as well. I'll just, I threw something out that's just kind of an idea, but it is an idea that is not well fleshed out in California. And I think if many of you do practice in public policy or planning in California, I think that's something to think about in terms of when you do general planning, are you able to build in funding targets or funding thresholds that match your policy? And do the targets in your planning documents or your end up embedded in your enabling legislation or your legislation that the council or the region passes? And I think that's rarely done. San Luis Obispo recently was able to embed specific funding percentages to match modal goals in their California general plan. And they're the first community that I think that I know of that has made that match between modal targets and funding, and have that specific language in their general plan, their circulation and land use element. But I think that should be explored more aggressively in California. I think it's a promising area for translating policy to things on the ground.
Well, first of all, thank you. This is very interesting stuff. Oftentimes when I leave the planning department, the first thing I hear from people is, well, autonomous vehicles are the future. So what would autonomous vehicles mean for this?
So my colleague Mike Boswell and I have been talking about this a lot, and we just we've been writing a little bit about it. The number one thing, and I brought up the term right of way a number of times, and in an autonomous vehicle future, and I say in the autonomous vehicle future, because it is impending, and I think everything we see indicates that it will be here before we're ready. And there are numerous sources that are starting to say that, including my colleague Eric Guerrera, who's a peer of Megan Ryerson, who's here a couple weeks ago, has surveyed some MPOs, and it's very clear that planners are not ready for this. They're not sure what to think, but in my opinion, what they should be thinking about is, what do you do with all this right-of-way? And the reason is because the presentation I presented today may be irrelevant in a world of autonomous vehicles. And I throw that out there knowing that it contradicts everything that I said, because maybe the future of our road typologies in 20 years will look nothing like it does today. Maybe the notion of a bidirectional street network is a flawed 19th century notion, or a 20th century notion that no longer functions well when you have computers that optimize a network. And really, you can have a 10-foot roadway where cars will pull off to the side and allow the other vehicles to pass when they're going in oppositional directions, or on a major thoroughfare, they're traveling so close together that they don't need to. That you don't need 4 or 5 lanes of traffic. I think it opens up a lot of of opportunities. And I don't think that we have to have the answers to that right now, but we ought to be asking, my opinion is we need to be asking, what, from a public sector policy and planning standpoint, what will all of that roadway end up being? That is a lot of land, and what will it be?
And the other implication is parking. Parking lots, buy a parking lot today because it will be a great site for investment in the future because you'll be able to replace that asphalt with other kind of development. We right now for the High-Speed Rail Authority are looking at an evaluation of how parking can be reduced at Burbank Station by basically a mix of more of the pedestrian connections within half a mile, within bicycling within 3 miles, because we've been given numbers of the state of parking each of the station, but the question to us is how much can we reduce by walking that parking requirement? How much can we reduce that parking area by bicycling, by having a great network of bicycling? And then how much can we reduce it by the autonomous vehicles? I met with some of the people from Lyft a couple of weeks ago who have entered into contractual relationship with General Motors. In general, they're looking at providing in the pure shared economy where none of us will own even our autonomous vehicle. We'll basically be able to plug in onto our whatever and be able to have that autonomous vehicle come to our residence. We won't even need a garage anymore because that autonomous vehicle will be coming and programmed on our call to that residence. It's really interesting because I think we're at the forefront of beginning, what are the urban and the planning ramifications of this? Because I think they're significant.
You talk about rights of way. I'm thinking that in a sense the counter is rights of stay, right? That you've got this space that on the one hand can be used to transport people through, and it's used, whereas the other uses are those of place, right? And so thinking in terms of a kind of property rights regime, as someone who's trained in economics, ideally we'd like markets that would allow people to in a sense bid for these rights, but the so-called non-convexities are very acute in such conditions, and so it seems to me that that's a fundamental part of this, and this autonomous vehicles brings to mind, and actually as you were making your presentation, it also brought to mind a very good friend of mine in Tokyo, Professor Oguri-san, Yukio Oguri. 17 years ago, he received a large grant from the Japanese government to develop this, I think is a beautiful project called Soft Car. And it's a car that's, in a sense, I mean, again, this was 17 years ago, that he was not just designing, he was building them. And what this car does is it receives, feedback from sensors. Not so different from what we have on the, what do we call this thing now on the Harbor Freeway? The fast track, right? So it's there, the fast track knows I'm there, I know it's there, right? But what the signaling does is it actually controls the car. And so there are different grades of speed that you can have. So a green light means there's effectively no limit on the speed at which the car can go, and there are gradations. But then he had this beautiful thing called rainbow color. And if you go into a rainbow zone, then first of all, the soft car would respond. The rainbow light would come on, and the car would move at effectively a kind of pedestrian pace. So one could imagine a kind of version of kind of reconciling this right of way versus right of stay through these kinds of autonomous vehicles, soft cars. So in a sense, you're adapting the vehicle to suit the environment rather than adapting the environment to suit the automobile and turning things around. So it wasn't quite in the form of a question, but it's the response evoked by the presentation.
So I have a question about the economic development aspect of this. You, in terms of Louisville, you said that, I mean, you showed a slide of some businesses. Are those post these changes that were made to the streets, or were they simply more viable afterwards, or?
Yeah, they were post-evaluation. All the photos I showed were from 2012 and 2013. Yes, that's right. I think most of them 2013.
And do you think that was because people were driving slower and noticing the place more, or were people walking in this area? Or?
So, yeah, I mean, this particular study, I did primarily qualitative analysis to try to explore what was happening. And the predominant kind of theory of the residents is that there were more people wanting to start businesses during this period, and that they were investing in their properties based on the kind of the public sector investment that was done there. So they were seeing it as the place that the kind of the new, the next area, the next it area. I have since engaged in some other research that tracks 14 cities that have done similar strategies over the last 10 years that have actually done a conversion. And what we've done is we've actually gone, are you familiar with the LEHD data set? So the longitudinal employment household data set that the census puts out. So what we can do with that data set is we can actually track jobs along a certain corridor, and we can buffer a corridor. And so what we can do is by using location quotient and some other philosophies, we can actually look at concentration in the corridor versus concentration in city and see what is actually happening in this area. Is it relative to the entire economy, relative to adjacent streets? And it's more mixed from that evaluation. But what you do see, so I've disclosed that it may be more nuanced. What you do see is that by industry, it is actually it is a little more pronounced. So particularly with food, dining, entertainment type districts that are doing this type of conversion, by and large, almost always you do see an increase in jobs in those sectors.
I'm really excited about giving a resounding gesture of appreciation to our speaker and our discussant for today.